In November of 2023, a young racer from Indiana named Gaige Herrera clinched the NHRA Pro Stock Motorcycle World Championship, riding for Vance and Hines, and the drag racing press wrote all the predictable stories about a new talent arriving and a dynasty beginning, and that was all true as far as it went. But what almost nobody mentioned was that the dynasty had already been running for almost 60 years. And it started with a $60 Austin sedan that a father in Montebello, California pulled out of a Lancaster junkyard because he was worried his sons were going to get into trouble. That's what this video is about. Not Gaige Herrera's championship, though we'll get to that. This is about the car that started everything, and the family that built it, and the era of drag racing that produced both of them. And why a story this good has been sitting mostly unnoticed in the margins of gasser history for half a century, while everybody else got the documentaries and the magazine retrospectives and the auction house bidding wars. Right, so let's go back to the beginning, because this story actually requires you to understand what was happening in Southern California drag racing in the mid-1960s, and why a family with no factory backing and no sponsor money could still build a car that ran with the best teams in the country. The gasser era is one of those things that looks simple from the outside and gets more complicated the deeper you go into it. The basic concept was this: NHRA had a class structure that sorted cars by weight to displacement ratio, and if you wanted to go fast, you found the lightest possible body that met the minimum wheelbase requirement and stuffed the biggest possible engine into it. Gas classes used pump gasoline or race gas, but not nitromethane, which is what separated them from fuel cars. And the supercharged variants like A/gas, supercharged, were allowed to run blowers, which is basically a mechanical air pump bolted to the top of the engine that forces more air in than the engine could suck in on its own. More air means you can burn more fuel, which means more power, which means faster elapsed times. And the whole game in A/GS was optimizing that formula as efficiently as possible. The cars that won were the ones that found the best combination of light body, small frontal area, and enough horsepower to move them down the quarter mile in the nines. By the mid-60s, the cars that had figured this out best were mostly running British-bodied machines. Willys Coupes from the 1930s and early 1940s had dominated the early gasser era, but the British stuff was even lighter and smaller. Ford Anglias were enormously popular because they weighed almost nothing and had a tiny frontal area, which helped aerodynamically even at speeds where aero doesn't really matter yet. But the Austin A40 and its relatives had one critical advantage over the Anglia that not everyone appreciated at first, which is that they were slightly larger, which let them fit bigger engines and still qualify for A/GS under the weight ratios the NHRA was using. The Anglia guys were basically limited to small block Chevrolets, while Austin racers could run big block or early Hemi combinations with room to work. California was the center of all this. The weather meant you could race year-round, and the aftermarket parts industry was clustered around Los Angeles, which meant you had access to the best speed equipment on the planet within a few miles of wherever you were building your car. Irwindale Raceway was the local proving ground. Pomona hosted the NHRA Winter Nationals, which was one of the most prestigious events on the calendar. The match racing circuit connected tracks up and down the coast and out to Hawaii, and teams that were good enough could make real money touring against each other. Big John Mazmanian was running an Austin gasser he called the Football, and it was candy-striped and supercharged, and it was probably the most famous car in A/GS at the time. Stone Woods and Cook had their Willys. The class had genuine stars and genuine fans and genuine rivalries, and the crowds that came to watch these things were enormous. And then there was the Herrera family from Montebello trying to figure out how to fit into all of that. John Herrera started racing for a reason that probably doesn't appear in very many drag racing documentaries, which is that he had sons and he was worried about them. The story his great-grandson Gaige tells is that John wanted to give the boys something to do that would keep them occupied and out of the kind of trouble that teenage kids in 1960s Southern California could find pretty easily. So he got into drag racing as a family project, and the family went all in on it. The first car was a 1948 Ford Anglia. If you haven't seen an Anglia, the thing looks like someone took a normal car and sat on it from the top until it compressed about 4 inches. Tiny wheels, tiny roof, tiny everything, and the styling is this aggressively vertical English thing from the late 1940s that looks like a cartoon car from the right angle. The Herreras ran it in B/gas with an unblown small block Chevrolet, which was the natural home for an Anglia, because you couldn't really run a blower in one without getting pushed into a class where you'd be fighting engines twice your displacement. Doug Thorley Headers had the car as a sponsored machine, which tells you they were already connected enough to get at least some equipment deal going. The Anglia was the learning car. They figured out how drag racing worked mechanically and competitively and what it took to keep a race car together on a regional circuit, and when they'd learned enough, they decided to step up. In 1966, John Herrera paid $60 for a 1950 Austin sedan from a wrecking yard in Lancaster, California. If you know where Lancaster is, you know it's out in the high desert northeast of LA proper, and it was not then, and is not now, the kind of place where people pay premium prices for vintage British sedans, so $60 was probably a fair deal for a body that was battered enough to need wrecking yard attention in the first place. What John saw when he looked at that car wasn't the condition it was in. He saw the weight and the wheelbase and the frontal area and the class possibilities, and he decided to build something serious. What came out of that decision was one of the most carefully constructed and elaborately finished gassers in Southern California. The chassis was built by NN Suspension out of La Puente, which at this point in drag racing history was a respected fabrication shop that understood what a serious A/GS car needed. The coil spring rear suspension setup they designed was engineered specifically to control weight transfer off the line, which is the difference between a car that hooks up and drives and a car that spins the tires and goes nowhere. They added Monroe shocks and Earhart rear disc brakes, which is a real safety item when you're running a car into the mid-nines, because you need to scrub speed after the finish line, and the parachute alone isn't always enough. Simpson drag parachute handled the big stopping, and the whole chassis package was sorted from the beginning. The engine was a blown 427 cubic inch Chevrolet big block built by a man named Jack Bayer. And here is the first place where you need to slow down, because there is a persistent description of this car as running a blown Chrysler, which gets repeated constantly in historical references. And it is technically true, but it is describing a later version of the car, not this one. And if you're trying to understand what the Herreras actually built in 1966, you need to know that the original configuration was a Chevy motor, and the Chrysler came in mid-1968 as part of a major upgrade. The Bayer Chevy was not a basic build. Crankshaft Company forged crank and steel rods, which was serious performance hardware in 1966, forged true pistons, a Sig Urson flat-tappet camshaft, and the cylinder heads were ported by Joe Mondello, who was already becoming one of the most sought-after head specialists on the West Coast, and whose reputation for squeezing airflow out of Chevrolet castings was essentially unmatched at the time. On top of that sat a Hampton reworked GMC 671 roots blower mounted on a Craigar manifold with bug catcher injection and driven at 24% overdrive, which is a pretty aggressive ratio that tells you they wanted boost, and they were willing to deal with the mechanical stress that comes from spinning the blower harder than stock. The transmission was an Art Car reworked Torque Flight automatic, which is a Chrysler unit that was commonly adapted for Chevrolet-powered cars in this era, because it was simply the strongest automatic transmission you could get, and drag racers will put a Ford transmission behind a Chevy engine without a second thought if it's the right tool. Late-model Oldsmobile rear end finished the drivetrain package. Now the body is where this car really separates itself from the typical gasser you see in old photographs. The Austin got a chopped top, which lowers the roofline and reduces frontal area. Anderson Industries supplied the fiberglass front end and doors, which saved significant weight while maintaining the appearance of the stock profile from a distance. The front clip flips forward for engine access, which in A/GS was becoming more standard as teams recognized how important quick turnaround between rounds could be. And then they painted it. 32 gallons of self-mixed candy apple red over metal flake, which is not a typo and is not an exaggeration. 32 gallons. The car absolutely glowed under lighting, and the gold leaf lettering and the polished Halabrand magnesium wheels completed a package that looked like it belonged at a show car display, not at a track. The interior got black rugging and black Naugahyde seating. Everything on this car was finished to a level that the Herreras were clearly not building something for the weekend bracket racer crowd. They were building something to run with the best. When they took the finished car to Irwindale for the first time, it ran 9.30 seconds at 156.52 miles per hour in A/gas supercharged. That is a number worth pausing on. Junior Thompson, who is one of the absolute quickest Austin gasser racers in the country, was running national records in the 9.03 range at 155 miles per hour during this same period. The Herreras' debut run put them right in the mix, not setting national records, but absolutely not embarrassing themselves either. They showed up with a car that could compete at the regional and national level, and they had done it without factory backing, without a wealthy sponsor, and starting with a $60 Junkyard body. The 1967 NHRA Winter Nationals at Pomona is photographically confirmed as an appearance for the car. There is an original period photograph of it at the event, and that photograph is currently available through an eBay collector who holds more than 10,000 original negatives from the drag racing era and who has detailed first-hand knowledge of the team and what they were doing. So we know they made the trip to Pomona. What we don't have is any documentation of how far they went in eliminations or what their qualifying position was, and that gap is genuinely frustrating because detailed results for non-winning competitors at national events in this era are largely gone. The time slips exist somewhere, if they still exist at all, but they didn't end up in any archive that's publicly accessible. What is documented in photographs is something arguably more interesting than a single event result. There is a photograph sourced from a man named Ken Yoshimura showing the Herrera Austin and Big John Mazmanian's football gasser together at the Kamehameha Shopping Center in Honolulu, Hawaii, circa 1966. That photograph is sitting on austinworks.com, which is the comprehensive online archive of Austin gasser history, and it confirms that the Herreras were touring on the match racing circuit alongside one of the most famous gasser drivers of the entire era. Think about what that means in practical terms. Match racing tours were a business. Promoters paid teams to show up and race each other at events because the crowd wanted to see the best cars go head-to-head, and if you were not running at a level where you could generate excitement and competition, you didn't get invited back. The fact that Herrera and Sons was traveling to Hawaii to race alongside Mazmanian means somebody with money on the line decided these guys were worth bringing across the Pacific Ocean. That's not a charity invitation. That's a competitive validation. Gaige Herrera's account in a 2023 Dragzine interview mentions that his great-grandfather worked really close with Brad Anderson and those guys back in the Irwindale days, which connects the family to another significant name in California drag racing history, and suggests the Herreras were genuinely embedded in the West Coast racing community rather than operating on its fringes. Okay, so by mid-1968, the gasser class was in a complicated position. The funny car had emerged, and it was eating the spotlight and the sponsorship money that had previously gone to cars like the football and the Herrera Austin. Stone Woods and Cook had already moved toward Top Fuel. Mazmanian himself was about to make the transition. The teams that stayed in A/GS were going to have to keep pushing performance just to stay relevant because the fans increasingly wanted to see something either faster or more spectacular, and a 9-second gasser, while impressive, was not going to hold attention the way a 6-second funny car was. The Herreras responded to this by doing what serious racing teams do when they have enough mechanical knowledge and enough determination, which is, they rebuilt the car. Midway through 1968, the blown 427 Chevy came out and a Chrysler Hemi engine went in. Simultaneously, the body got upgraded to a full flip-up one-piece Anderson Industries fiberglass shell, which was the latest development in reducing weight and improving serviceability. The eBay photo collector, who has the period negatives, describes this upgrade explicitly, noting both the engine change and the new body as a single transformation that happened mid-season. The specific displacement of the Chrysler Hemi and the Herrera car is not documented in any source I've been able to locate. In A/GS during this period, Austin racers running Hemis were typically using the early 354 or 392 cubic inch engines, sometimes stroked beyond 400 inches depending on what class math they were working with. What matters for the story is that the Hemi upgrade represented a significant commitment. These engines were expensive to build and complicated to tune, and the Herreras chose to go that direction at a moment when plenty of other teams were abandoning the class entirely. This is the version of the car that most historical sources are describing when they say, Herrera and Sons ran a blown Chrysler-powered Austin, and this is the car that caught the attention of a writer and photographer named Jess Money, who was working for Popular Hot Rodding magazine. The December 1968 issue of Popular Hot Rodding ran a feature on what the magazine called the new Herrera Supergasser. The article was written and photographed by Jess Money, and it included a cutaway technical illustration by a man named Tom West. And here is where the story gets a footnote that is genuinely remarkable outside of gasser history specifically. Tom West went on to become one of the most celebrated illustrators in drag racing history. His cutaway drawings showing the mechanical innards of race cars became iconic. His work eventually appeared in the Smithsonian Institution. He had a long career doing technical illustration for the drag racing press, and his ability to show what was happening inside a machine in a way that was both accurate and visually compelling was unlike anyone else doing that work at the time. The Herrera Austin sedan was his first published illustration. West described the genesis of the drawing in a 2013 National Dragster profile by Phil Burgess. He said he'd had no real reason to actually draw a race car until he talked with Jess Money, who was going to do the new Herrera Supergasser for Popular Hot Rodding, and he went along when Money shot the article and got the reference photos he needed for the illustration. He drew it about 3 feet long on vellum using drafting pencil and later enhanced the line work with pen to add depth, and the result ran in the December issue alongside Money's photographs and text. So when you're looking at the career of Tom West, which eventually extended to some of the most significant race cars in drag racing history, the thing that started all of it was this family from Montebello and their candy apple red Austin with the Hemi under the flip-up hood. That's a connection worth making even if nobody made it at the time. The Popular Hot Rodding feature is the single most significant piece of period documentation we have for this car, and it's frustratingly difficult to get your hands on today. It's not digitized anywhere publicly accessible. It exists in the collections of people who kept their copies of the magazine from 1968 and in the stacks of libraries that collected automotive periodicals and occasionally on eBay from sellers moving old car magazines. If you're doing serious research on the Herrera team, this is the primary source you want. And the fact that it hasn't been scanned and made available says something about the general state of drag racing history preservation, which is a problem the community has been dealing with for decades. The photographs on austinworks.com give you the visual. Rob Stewart, who compiled that resource, has put together the most detailed online documentation of the car's specifications and history that exists anywhere. And his technical write-up matches the period descriptions closely enough that it's likely drawing directly from the PHR article or from people who had access to it. There are also at least 2 original period photographs in the collection of that eBay seller with the 10,000 negatives. But the actual magazine article sitting in somebody's collection is the thing the documentary researcher needs to find. Now let's talk about what happened to the car after the racing stopped, because this is where the story gets a different kind of interesting. At some point in the years after the gasser era wound down, the Herrera Austin stopped racing and made its way north. By 1988, a man named Tom Wilford discovered the car in Portland, Oregon. It had been painted black. It was running 8th mile events at some local strip. The candy apple red paint was gone. The gold leaf lettering was gone. The Hallebrand wheels may or may not have still been on it. It was just another old race car that had been repainted and repurposed, and the people running it may or may not have known what they had. Wilford knew. He recognized the car and in 1990 sold it to Charlie O'Neill, who repainted it red and put it back on the track as Troke and O'Neill with Tom Thompson driving. By the mid-1990s, it had been sold again to Keith Harvey of Southern California. After that, the trail goes cold. The current whereabouts of the Herrera Austin are unknown, and that gap is something a documentary could potentially fill by reaching out to the vintage gasser community and the Southern California car collector network. Because cars like this don't just disappear, they just change hands in ways that don't always get documented publicly. The possibility that the original Austin is sitting in a garage somewhere waiting to be found is genuinely real. These cars have a habit of surviving because the people who end up with them tend to recognize that what they have is historically significant, even if they can't always document exactly why. But the car is only one thread of this story, and it's not actually the most important one. The most important one is the family itself. John Herrera built the Austin with his sons Manuel, Richard, and Philip as a family project intended to keep young men occupied and connected to something constructive. Gaige mentions 4 sons in interviews, but historical documentation names only 3, and that discrepancy is something nobody has resolved publicly. Whether there was a 4th son who wasn't involved in the racing, or whether the recollection is approximate, is unclear. What is clear is that the racing worked as family glue, and that it planted something that didn't stop. Phil Herrera, one of John's sons, kept racing. He built a 1968 blown small block Camaro in A/gas, and according to Gaige, that car still exists and Phil still drives it occasionally, which means there is a direct mechanical connection between the founding generation of this family's racing and the people who are still at it today. Phil's wife, Jacques, has been alongside all of it for decades, and both of them eventually relocated from California to Indiana to support their grandson's NHRA career, which is the kind of commitment that puts a lot of things in perspective. Phil's son, Augustine Herrera, was born July 11, 1970 in Whittier, California. He grew up with the stories of the Austin and the Gasser Wars, and John Herrera's original vision for what racing could do for a family. Augustine didn't become a professional racer in the traditional sense, but he built a serious amateur career. He won the NHRA Super Street Championship in 1999. He took the Summit ET National Championship in Super Pro Motorcycle in 2009. He became vice president of Herrera's Refrigeration, which is the family business. And eventually he became the NHRA and NMCA National Tech Director, which is a role that requires deep knowledge of how race cars are built and what the rules are and how to apply them fairly, which is exactly the kind of knowledge you accumulate over decades of racing in your family's tradition. And then there's Gaige. Gaige Herrera is John Herrera's great-grandson. When Gaige won the NHRA Pro Stock Motorcycle World Championship in 2023 riding for Vance and Hines, he was completing a line that runs directly from that $60 Austin sedan. He told Drag Illustrated that his great-grandfather started the whole drag racing thing to get his 4 sons off the street, and that they had Austins and Opals back in the day running gassers, and the way he talks about it, you can hear that he knows where he comes from. Even though that world and the world he races in now are separated by almost 60 years and several categories of technological complexity. In 2024, Gaige won the championship again. Then he set an NHRA record of 11 consecutive pro stock motorcycle wins, which is the kind of number that makes people stop and double-check it. 11 in a row, in a class with factory-backed teams and professional engineers and riders who have been doing this their entire careers. And in 2025, Augustine's daughter Miranda Herrera earned her NHRA Supercomp license, becoming the first woman in the family to do so, which means the next chapter of this story hasn't been written yet. 4 generations, 1 family, 1 thread connecting a $60 Junkyard Austin in Lancaster, California to an NHRA championship in 2024. That is an extraordinary thing when you lay it all out, and the fact that most people don't know the front end of that story is exactly the kind of gap that motorsports history channels exist to fill. Let me give you some context about where the Herrera Austin sat in the competitive picture. Because 9.3s at 156 miles per hour doesn't mean much unless you know what everyone else was running. Junior Thompson, who is arguably the quickest Austin gasser driver of the era, was running 9.03 at 155 miles per hour when he was on national record pace. The Herreras were about 3/10 back, which in drag racing terms is a meaningful gap, but it's not the gap between a serious competitor and a club racer. It's the gap between the absolute quickest car in class and the car that beats most of what it lines up against most of the time. Big John Mazmanian's football was running at a similar level before Mazmanian moved toward funny cars. Jim Oddie had a blown 392 Hemi Austin that was competitive. Gene Chimbella, Ed Middlebrook, Dan Brogier, and the Meyer and Clough team were all running Austin Gassers in A/GS on the West Coast during this period. This was a class with real depth, and the Herreras were somewhere in the middle of that depth, which, given their resources, was a legitimate achievement. The UK National Street Rod Association's historical records on the Gasser era list Herrera and Sons alongside Stone Woods and Cook and the Kohler brothers and Brasher and Cummings and Hamburus and Mitchell and Bones and Dubach as one of the recognized teams of the era. That's notable because whoever compiled that list was trying to document who actually mattered during the Gasser Wars, and this family made the cut. What's interesting is that they made the cut without some of the advantages that names like Stone Woods and Cook had. No factory program, no wealthy backer, a family refrigeration business as the economic foundation, the $60 Junkyard body as the starting point. Everything they built came out of their own knowledge and their own labor and whatever deals they could put together with suppliers who believed in what they were doing. The Gasser class itself was winding down by the time the Herreras upgraded to the Hemi in mid-1968. NHRA eliminated gas classes entirely by 1972, which meant the entire world that produced these cars was essentially abolished as a competitive category within a few years of the popular hot rodding feature. The teams that had been dominant in A/GS either transitioned to funny cars or top fuel or went back to street racing or stopped racing altogether. The cars got dispersed to private collections and the occasional lucky buyer who found one at a local track without knowing what it was. The Herreras kept racing. They just moved to different cars in different classes as the world changed around them, and the tradition stayed alive in the family even as the specific form it took evolved beyond recognition. By the time Gaige Herrera showed up at an NHRA national event on a Vance and Hines-sponsored pro-stock motorcycle, the surface similarities to John Herrera's Austin sedan are essentially zero. But the underlying thing is the same. Family, competition, building something and proving it works, taking something seriously enough to do it right. John Herrera bought that Austin to give his sons a purpose and something they could work on together. That turns out to have been an extremely successful plan by any measure you want to apply. The sons raced. Their sons raced. Their grandchildren are racing at the professional level of their sport right now. What started as a father's concern about what his boys were doing on the streets of Montebello, California in the mid-1960s is still producing results 6 decades later. There are a few things I want to flag as genuinely uncertain, because this is history, and history has gaps, and honest documentary work acknowledges them. The specific Chrysler displacement in the upgraded car is unknown. Nobody who's documented this car publicly has nailed down whether it was a 354 or a 392 or something else, and the original PHR article would likely answer that question. The fourth son. Gaige says 4 sons. The historical record names 3. This could mean there was a fourth who didn't race or whose name just didn't end up in the available documentation, or it could mean the number 4 is approximate in Gaige's recollection. Without talking directly to Phil Herrera or another family member who was there, you can't resolve it. The car's current location. After Keith Harvey bought it in the mid-1990s in Southern California, the trail is cold. It might be restored. It might be in pieces. It might be sitting in perfect condition in someone's heated garage right now. Somebody in the vintage gasser community probably knows where it ended up. And the competition record beyond the debut time is basically undocumented. We know the car ran 9.30 at Irwindale. We know it showed up at the 1967 Winter Nationals. We know it was match racing in Hawaii. Specific eliminations results, national records, or event wins just aren't in the record anywhere accessible. That's frustrating for a story this good, but it's also honest about what happened to the documentation for a lot of working-class racing programs from this era. The teams that got the comprehensive records preserved were usually the ones with factory backing or media relationships that generated consistent coverage. A family team from Montebello racing on their own money didn't have a PR operation keeping score, and the results that weren't preserved at the time are mostly gone. The person to talk to about all of this is Phil Herrera. He is alive. He is in Indiana supporting Gaige's career alongside his wife Jacques. He was there for the original car. He is the direct link between what John Herrera built in 1966 and what the family is still doing today, and an interview with him would answer most of the questions this research left open. The eBay seller with the 10,000 negatives has demonstrated detailed knowledge of the team and potentially has photographs that haven't appeared in any published source. Rob Stewart at austinworks.com has the most comprehensive public archive on the car and may have unpublished material or contacts that could fill in more of the record. And somewhere out there, a December 1968 issue of Popular Hot Rodding is sitting on a shelf or in a box with Jess Money's article and Tom West's first illustration and the complete technical specifications of the car as it existed in its most developed form. That's the document you want. The story it tells is waiting to be connected to everything else the family has done since. So this is the story of Herrera and Sons, a father from Montebello who wanted to keep his boys out of trouble, a $60 Austin sedan from a Lancaster wrecking yard, a blown Chevrolet built to an exceptionally high standard with parts sourced from the best specialists in Southern California, a debut run of 9.30 at 156 miles per hour, a trip to Hawaii with Big John Mazmanian, a mid-season upgrade to a Chrysler Hemi and a new fiberglass body, a feature article in a major magazine accompanied by the first illustration a future Smithsonian-level artist ever published, and then years of silence while the car changed hands and got painted black and ran eighth-mile races in Portland, Oregon until someone recognized it and bought it back. And running parallel to all of that, a family that kept racing. Through the end of the gasser era and the rise of the funny car and the development of pro stock and the whole evolution of drag racing from a sport run on junkyard parts and family labor into a multi-million-dollar professional entertainment industry. 3 generations between John and Gaige, 4 now if you count Miranda. The Camaro that Phil Herrera still drives occasionally, the refrigeration company that funded it all, the championship at Pomona in 2023 that most of the people reporting on it didn't connect to the candy apple red Austin that made the whole thing possible. History doesn't always make the connections for you. Sometimes you have to do that yourself.